It was June 30th, 1988, and it had been a warm, sunny summer afternoon, and I was just home, and it was kind of late afternoon, early evening, and I got a phone call. And I picked up the phone when it rang, and the guy on the other end said, "Hey, this is Sid Grove from the Cache County Jail. I wondered," he goes, "How are you tonight?" And I said, "Oh, I'm fine." And he said, "I wondered if you could come and stop by my office and talk to me for a few minutes." And I said, "Well, sure," because I had known him and I worked with a youth group and I was trying to set up a class for college girls on self-defense and protection on campus. And I thought, oh, he probably just wants to talk about that. So I said, sure. And I only lived a few blocks away. And so I drove on over and I walked up the courthouse steps. And as I got up there, he was right at the front of the office as I came in. And I said, "How are you doing?" And he goes, "Well, not very good." And I said, "Oh, well, that's too bad. How come?" And he said, "Well, I have a warrant for your arrest." And he hands me this paper, and I'm like, "Yeah, right." And I laughed, and he didn't laugh. And so all of a sudden, some men had come up to him and said, "We need to see you," and some other police officers. And so he said, "Well, I'll be right back, but you need to read this so you know what you're being charged with." And he went off with these other police officers. And I'm like, "Yeah, right." And I thought, they're just playing some kind of joke on me or something. And so I kind of laughed, and no one laughed. And so anyway, he had told me to go with this one police officer and they would help me and he'd be back to talk to me in just a few minutes. And so they led me around this little area and through this door. And the next thing I knew, there was a woman police officer and she took my purse and my keys, and I'm still thinking, I can't believe this is happening to me. And I find myself in the drunk tank. And so I'm sitting on the floor in this drunk tank all by myself. And I'm just sitting there like, I don't believe this. This has to be a joke. And so, I'm just I'm looking at the paper, but I'm not really reading it because I'm kind of freaked out that it's a warrant for my arrest. And I'm still thinking it's a joke, but nobody was laughing and I was in there all by myself. So I'm sitting there really kind of talking to myself because no one's around, and I'd read a few lines from the paper and then I'd look up and look around and nobody came back, and I just kept thinking, I noticed the line said burglary, and I thought, I never stole a piece of candy in my life. And so I'm starting to get a little bit worried. And then the sheriff came back in and he said, "Well, have you read the whole thing yet?" And I said, "No, I'm still on the burglary line." And I laughed and he didn't laugh. And then he goes, "Well, you really need to read the whole thing so that you understand it." And then he laughed, and I thought, I remember just sitting there thinking, I've never stolen anything. I was starting to get worried because it was to the point, it was past a joke and nobody was laughing. And so I looked at the bottom, and I wouldn't get more than a few lines, and then I just kind of quit reading because I was just kind of overwhelmed by what it said. And I was just nervous. And so I kind of looked at the bottom, and I saw on the very bottom, it said Belle, Eternity with Bob. Finally, I'm like, is this a proposal? But then it didn't say, "Will you marry me?" or anything. It was a legitimate warrant. I mean, it had all the information filled in, and it's this big long page of all this official technical stuff. And so anyway, the sheriff finally came back, and so I'm thinking, okay, it has to be a joke. And he goes, "Well, there's a young man here that will bail you out if you'll say yes." And so then I was just relieved because I was just thinking, okay, I'm going to get arrested. I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to be excommunicated from my church. I was just beside myself. And so anyway, in walks my husband. And he just kind of saunters in, and he's just kind of looking at me sheepishly. And apparently they had been watching me on a monitor where I couldn't see them, and they were just laughing, having the best old time. And so I thought that he'd at least say, "Will you marry me?" when he walked in the room. And he just kind of looked at me, and it was funny because I was looking at him and he was looking at me. And the sheriff kind of said, "Well, I think you two, maybe I should throw her back in, make sure she's going to say yes." And he goes, "Maybe I should leave you two alone." And it was funny because then my husband got kind of shy about it. And so anyway, they let us out and we went outside on the steps of the jail, and then he proposed to me and asked me to marry him. And so I did say yes, and I learned a lesson. Don't be on too good of a first name basis with your local Cache County sheriff. And so anyway, that was not the way I had envisioned ever getting engaged, but it has been quite a memorable story throughout the years and been a lot of fun. And after we got engaged, well, some of the ladies, the women police officers on the way out, they were just kind of mad because they thought that was really rude to me and that they couldn't believe they did that to me, and they were feeling bad for me, and so they were kind of getting hassled by that. So then anyway, we decided we'd go and tell my parents that we'd been engaged, that we had gotten engaged. And so we drove over to my parents' house, and I found out later that my husband, my now husband, had asked my father before. He was kind of old-fashioned, and he had asked him if he could have my hand in marriage, and that impressed my dad that he would ask him. And we went and we were showing off my ring and everything to people. And my dad, well, he kind of broke the tension because it had been quite an emotional night between the getting arrested and put in jail and then getting engaged and then coming to tell everybody. And he said, "Good, I was afraid she'd never say yes or something." And so that kind of made us all laugh and de-stressed us. And then I had a church commitment after that. So this was a very unusual engagement night. So I left my fiance because I had an appointment to go do something for my church. So I left for about an hour, and I went to my appointment, and we were just visiting, and I had told how I had got engaged, and so that was pretty funny because here I was at this meeting, and then I finished up my meeting and went back, and then we celebrated our engagement, and my husband thinks that he got me really good, and I've still been waiting for a way to get even and come up with a really good way to get back at him. But the one thing I will say about marrying my husband is it started off with a bang, and it's never been boring since because I never know what he's going to do. And our marriage has kind of been like that because he's full of surprises, and life continues to be that way. I'm never quite sure what to expect next. And so that's just a funny engagement story that will be passed down for generations in my family. And I also learned another lesson because I had been laughing telling my husband about how a friend of mine had gotten engaged because her boyfriend feigned that he had to give a talk in church and he needed to practice on the way, and he made sure he showed up late, and so he was telling her, "You've got to drive, Cindy, because I have to practice my talk." And so she's speeding to get him in to church on time so he could give his talk, and she gets pulled over by a police officer, and the officer comes to hand her a ticket, and it had a marriage proposal on it. And I had not thought about the fact I told him that story and thought that was so funny a month or so before, and I never dreamed that he would, my fiance, my husband now, would get me good just like that. So that's the end of my engagement story.
All right. Hey, thanks.